Gun advocates hail Senator Mike Hilger's proposal to make gun laws uniform across Nebraska as essential to protecting our Second Amendment rights. Critics, however, say it is a dangerous piece of legislation that would compromise public safety. It's a constitutional right cherished by many Americans, but one Nebraska lawmaker says it's being infringed upon by what many describe as an uneven patchwork of gun laws across Nebraska. People lawfully possessing a firearm and suddenly being prohibited when they enter a town.
These are people in our community who want to just defend themselves, to have the security that comes with owning a firearm.
Senator Mike Hilger's bill LB 68 would strip Nebraska cities, except Omaha, of having their own individual gun ordinances, making gun laws more uniform across the state. Rod Moeller of the Nebraska Firearms Owners Association says cities shouldn't be able to place restrictions on a constitutionally protected right.
If there are going to be restrictions, and certainly there are some, but the legislature should be the legal body that establishes those so that it can be consistent across the entire state.
Under Lincoln's ordinances, a person is prohibited from possessing any firearms for 10 years for misdemeanors such as marijuana possession, 2 DUIs, carrying a blade above the legal limit, and indecent exposure. Lincoln Police Chief Jeff Bleimeister testified against Hilger's legislation, saying it would also enable people to openly carry rifles into public venues like Pinnacle Bank Arena and Pinewood Bowl.
Would it make you think, I'm going to pick up the phone and call 911? But we can't respond, because if we do, this particular piece of legislation has a punitive phase saying that opens us up for civil liability.
The bill narrowly cleared a filibuster, and an amendment to protect Lincoln's gun ordinances has been filed. Reporting for Star City News, I'm Joe Harris. Yes, Seth, last week was hardly the first time Lincoln suffered poor air quality due to grass fires in Kansas. It's been a problem for more than a decade, and Mayor Beutler says things need to change. But will his complaint to Kansas make a difference? Ranchers in the Flint Hills region of Kansas annually conduct controlled burns to ward off woody plant species and give their cattle better grass to graze with. They burn the pastures because it's cheaper than other methods. But sometimes it results in this: concentrated smoke pollution blowing into cities like it did in Lincoln last week. Lincoln Mayor Chris Beutler says the air pollution this year appears to be one of the worst he's seen since taking office. He's received complaints from residents, including a 61-year-old asthma sufferer.
I'm taking inhaled steroids just to try and survive the day. Each breath is miserable, even staying indoors, and this seems to go on for days.
In 2010, the Kansas Department of Health and Environment issued a smoke management plan to lessen the smoke exceedances by spreading the controlled burns out between February and April. According to the Sierra Club, in the 5 years since the plan's implementation, the exceedances actually increased.
Has allowed enough time to pass to know that their previous management plan has failed.
Beutler says he hopes his letter to the KDHE will engage them in talks over how to revise their smoke management plan. That may not be easy, though. KDHE Communications Director Matt Keith says their data shows Kansas is in compliance with the EPA's ambient air quality standards for smoke generated from burning. He says KDHE does not have the authority to regulate controlled burns, and says they've only helped ranchers determine when to burn.
One of the things that we provided for ranchers is a predictive weather model that makes it really easy to see when the best days are to burn and days to avoid.
Beutler says legal action is a last resort and prefers the friendlier method of talking to Kansas. He says if he doesn't hear back from them, he'll probably take the issue to Governor Pete Ricketts and the Attorney General. Reporting for Star City News, I'm Joe Harris. Jose Sandoval killed Vivian Tuttle's daughter Yvonne in the 2002 Norfolk bank shootings.
Sandoval told Yvonne to get down on her knees, and he shot her in the back of the head. And I watched that film 6 times during the trials.
Tuttle says Nebraskans should keep the death penalty so stories like her daughter's don't happen as much. During an October 18th public hearing at the Capitol, Tuttle read a note from her granddaughter Christine, who has received mail from her mother's killer.
I know that I will never receive another letter from him if he has to be put to death. I also want to know that In death row, he will never be able to hurt another person.
Rulo, Nebraska cult leader Michael Ryan tortured Miriam Kelly's brother James Tim to death in 1985.
Michael Ryan was sentenced to death over 30 years ago, and until last year, Michael Ryan sat on death row, and then he died of cancer.
Kelly says the death penalty fails murder victims' family members, regardless of whether or not they want to see the killer executed. She says it doesn't carry out the promised justice, while also forcing them to relive painful memories every time executions are appealed.
I would give anything to go back in time and change that death sentence to life imprisonment. If that happened, my children would have grown up without seeing their uncle's killer become a celebrity as he slowly worked his way through the court system.
Whether they're for or against the death penalty, the topic is a source of grief for victims' families. But this may be the last time the issue comes up, because on November 8th, Nebraska voters will decide on the death penalty's fate.
Oh, Sir Smith.
In 2015, state lawmakers passed a law abolishing the death penalty. Referendum 426 has put that law on hold, and Nebraskans will vote whether to retain the law or repeal it.
Jose Sandoval. Murdered.
Nebraskans for the Death Penalty is one of the sponsors of Referendum 426 and urges voters to keep the death penalty by voting to repeal LB 268. The organization wasn't available for comment, but Senator Mike Groney, who also supports the death penalty, says its purpose is not retribution, but rather serving justice to those who commit the most heinous crimes. Dan Parsons is a spokesman for Retain Adjust Nebraska, a group that encourages Nebraskans to keep the death penalty abolished by voting retain.
We certainly understand that these crimes that are committed are terrible, heinous crimes. And absolutely the people that commit those crimes, they absolutely ought to be punished. We believe firmly that the death penalty is a false promise to Nebraskans. It no longer serves any usefulness in our state. It's wasting millions of dollars.
An Institute for Economic Inquiry and Creighton University study says only 1% of Nebraska's murder convictions in 41 years resulted in an execution. Based on justice spending of other death penalty states, it estimates maintaining the death penalty annually costs Nebraska nearly $15 million more than having life in prison without parole as the highest punishment. Those who want to keep the death penalty challenge the study's accuracy, saying it didn't use actual data from Nebraska's justice system.
From 25 years in private practice, if I would see that type of report submitted by opposing counsel, I don't think it would get admitted into evidence because it wouldn't follow the standards necessary. But yet it's now being in numbers suggested to voters.